Imagine a world where you don't know your own name, where time has no meaning, and where the biggest events in the world pass you by without a whisper. This was the reality for millions of people living in medieval Europe, a time when life was simple, harsh, and largely unchanged for centuries. Picture yourself in a small village, surrounded by fields and forests, where the most exciting thing that happens is the annual harvest festival. You have no idea what year it is, or even what day of the week it might be. You've never seen a clock, a newspaper, or a map. The only thing you know for sure is that you must work from dawn to dusk just to survive, and that the world beyond your village is a mysterious and dangerous place. In this world, you and everyone around you are almost invisible. Your life is anonymous, and your existence is a tiny, almost unnoticeable blip in the grand scheme of things. This might sound like a fantasy, but it was the reality for the peasants and common folk who lived in medieval Europe, a period that lasted from about the 5th century to the 15th century. This essay will take you on a journey through this fascinating but often overlooked era, exploring how people lived, what they believed, and how their world changed over time. Life in a medieval village was centered around the land. Most people were farmers or peasants, who worked the fields owned by a local lord. The lord was like a mini king, a powerful figure who controlled the land and all the people who lived on it. In exchange for the right to farm the land, peasants had to give a portion of their crops to the lord and work on his estate a few days each week. This system, known as feudalism, was the backbone of medieval society. It was a rigid social structure where everyone knew their place, and there was little chance of moving up in the world. Villages were small and isolated. You might live your entire life without ever leaving the area where you were born. The nearest town, if there was one, could be a day's walk away. Communication was slow, and news traveled by word of mouth. If someone in the next village got married or had a baby, you might not hear about it for weeks or even months. The world beyond your village was a place of legends and myths, full of dragons, knights, and magical creatures. You might hear stories about distant lands, but they seemed as real as the fairy tales told by the village elder. The church was the center of village life. It was more than just a place of worship. It was the heart of the community. The local priest was one of the few people who could read and write, and he was the link between the villagers and the wider world. He baptized babies, married couples, and performed the last rites for the dying. The church also provided a sense of structure and meaning in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. The rhythm of the church calendar, with its saints' days and religious festivals, gave people something to look forward to and a way to mark the passage of time. But even the church had its limits. The priests and bishops often knew little more than the peasants they served. The church was a powerful institution, but it was also deeply flawed. The higher-ups in the church hierarchy, like the bishops and the pope, were often more concerned with politics and power than with the spiritual well-being of their flock. The Great Schism, a split in the church that lasted from 1378 to 1417, was a perfect example of this. During this time there were 2 and sometimes 3 popes, each claiming to be the true leader of the church. The confusion and chaos this caused were immense, but most peasants remained blissfully unaware of it. The church continued to function as usual, and the lives of the common people went on as before. One of the most striking things about medieval village life was the lack of privacy. People lived in close quarters, often sharing a single room with their entire family. In the summer, it was not uncommon for peasants to go about their daily tasks naked, especially when working in the fields. There was no concept of personal space or individual identity. You were part of a family, a village, and a community, and your needs and desires were secondary to those of the group. This lack of individual identity also extended to names. Many people did not have last names or surnames. They were known by their first name, and sometimes by their occupation or the place they came from. For example, a man named John who was a miller might be called John Miller, or a woman named Mary who lived in the village of Green might be called Mary Green. When surnames did become more common, they were often adopted from the local lord or the family's occupation. This is why we have names like Smith, Taylor, and Baker today. The medieval mind had a very different concept of time than we do today. For us, time is linear, with a clear past, present, and future. We can look at a calendar and know exactly what day it is, and we can check our watches to know what time it is. But for medieval people, time was cyclical. It revolved around the seasons and the church calendar. The idea of a specific year or date was almost meaningless. People knew when it was time to plant crops or harvest them, but they didn't have a sense of history or the passage of time as we understand it. The world seemed eternal, and life was a constant cycle of work, rest, and celebration. This sense of timelessness was reinforced by the lack of change in daily life. For most of the medieval period, life was relatively stable. The methods of farming and the tools used changed very little over the centuries. The same was true for crafts and trades. New ideas and technologies were rare, and when they did appear, they were often met with suspicion and resistance. The church, which was the primary source of knowledge and authority, was conservative and resistant to change. It was a world where tradition and custom were more important than innovation and progress. But even in this world of stability and tradition, there were signs of change. The Great Schism, the decline of chivalry, and the rise of professional armies were all early indicators that the medieval world was starting to shift. The Church, despite its power and influence, was not immune to these changes. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which affirmed the power of the papacy and the doctrine of transubstantiation, was a high point for the Church. But the schism that began in 1378 and lasted for nearly 40 years was a significant blow to the Church's authority and reputation. The split between the Avignon and Roman popes created confusion and division, and it was a sign that the Church's hold on the hearts and minds of the people was beginning to weaken. Meanwhile, the knightly class, once the elite of medieval society, was facing its own challenges. The heavy armor and powerful horses that had made knights the dominant force on the battlefield were becoming obsolete. New weapons like the English longbow and the crossbow could penetrate even the strongest armor, and the rise of professional infantry meant that wars were no longer fought by noble knights, but by trained soldiers. The age of chivalry was coming to an end, and with it, the feudal system that had defined medieval society for centuries. The medieval world was also a place of great cruelty and violence. The legal system was harsh, and punishment was often brutal. Trials by ordeal, where the accused had to prove their innocence by surviving a test of fire, water, or combat, were common. If you were accused of a crime, you were guilty until proven innocent, and the odds were stacked against you. The Church, which was supposed to be a source of comfort and protection, often contributed to the brutality. The Inquisition, a series of investigations into heresy and other religious crimes, was a dark chapter in medieval history. People accused of heresy could be tortured, imprisoned, and even burned at the stake. Despite all this, there were moments of beauty and creativity in medieval life. The art of the period, from illuminated manuscripts to Gothic cathedrals, was some of the most stunning and intricate ever created. Music, poetry, and storytelling were important parts of village life, and they provided a way for people to express themselves and connect with each other. The church, for all its flaws, was a source of inspiration and beauty, and the great cathedrals that still stand today are a testament to the skill and devotion of medieval craftsmen. The medieval period was a time of contrasts. It was a world of poverty and wealth, of beauty and ugliness, of faith and doubt. For the majority of people, life was hard and often short. But it was also a time of resilience and community. People came together to celebrate, to mourn, and to support each other through the challenges of daily life. The bonds of family and community were strong, and they provided a sense of stability and belonging in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. As the medieval period drew to a close, the seeds of change had been planted. The Renaissance, a period of great cultural and intellectual revival, was just around the corner. The invention of the printing press would revolutionize the way information was disseminated, and the exploration of the New World would open up new horizons for trade and discovery. The medieval world, with its rigid social structures and traditional ways of life, would give way to a new era of progress and change. But the legacy of the medieval period lives on in many ways. The values of community, tradition, and faith that were so important in medieval society continue to shape our world today. The challenges and struggles of medieval people, their joys and sorrows, are a reminder of the enduring human spirit. As we look back on this fascinating period in history, we can see both the darkness and the light, and we can learn from the lessons of the past. In the end, the medieval world was a place where the invisible became visible, where the timeless began to change, and where the anonymous found their voices. It was a world that, in many ways, laid the foundations for the world we live in today. And as we continue to explore the past, we can gain a deeper understanding of who we are and where we came from.